When Justin Trudeau was elected as Canada's Prime Minister in 2015, local and international press drooled over him. Many saw him as this cool and collected heartthrob who could do no wrong. Tabloids, newspapers put him on their front cover and even compared him and his family to the Kennedys in the US. And to many, Trudeau's rise to power was like a breath of fresh air. His policies were considered bold and conventional. Look at this moment when he welcomed Syrians at the height of the refugee crisis. Trudeau's political persona was forward-thinking and outspoken about newcomers, diversity and multiculturalism. He also spoke directly to Indigenous people and began a reconciliation process. And among his many other policies, he began to make Canada a climate leader. On that last point, let's trace his legacy.
Canada is back, my good friends.
The recent polls show that 7 out of 10 Canadians are worried about how fast the planet is warming. The fact that it didn't snow in Vancouver over the Christmas period was a sobering reminder of that. J2D producer Mel Malik reached out to 3 young people there who either work in the green space as consultants or are getting their hands dirty at a grassroots level, from expanding solar and renewable capacity across the commercial and residential sector to educating their peers about the impacts of the meat and dairy industry.
How would you rate Justin Trudeau's climate record?
Okay, big question, tough question.
To me, the part I liked the most about it over the last 10 years is that it was on people's minds.
And initially, I was, very optimistic about it because the one word he was talking about was climate change and climate action.
As a prime minister that believes that climate change is a real thing and we need to combat it and we're a little late to the party, I think he did okay. Was he perfect? No human's perfect.
I went to university and we did a lot on Indigenous studies. And then he kept talking about pipelines, and pipelines were all over the news.
He was trying to at least do something about it, where I feel like the potential Conservative government will just put it on the back burner and treat it like a non-issue.
And Trudeau also put us into the Paris Act. So, we're hopping on that global team to kind of, reduce our emissions and make that a reality.
If you're pro pipelines and, but on the other end, you're saying, no, we have to cut down on carbon emissions and aim for net zero and different topics like this. It was very, you're saying one thing, but you're doing another thing.
If I were to tell you right now, are you aware of the Canada Greener Home Loan? A lot of people be like, what are you talking about? And then, I would tell you, well, it's a federal government program. They're willing to give you $40,000 at zero interest for 10 years to upgrade your home and to make it more energy efficient and to move you away from fossil fuel energy.
So I kind of felt like I was lied to a little bit.
There are things that are being done behind the scenes, and if you know about it, you're already a few steps ahead. But the issue is bad news travels faster than good news, right?
Pipelines not only cause displacement of marginalized communities, but is a huge contributor to polluting our waterways, just damaging natural habitat, the biodiversity around us. And that was one of the things that made my heart sink a little bit.
What would a change in government mean for Canada's climate goals?
I am scared if we have a Conservative Party.
I am a little bit worried, it's a reality that we have to confront.
I think it would be really bad. I think a lot of the funding that nonprofits apply for, a lot of the grants, they might be significantly reduced or even cut altogether.
It's a little bit tricky, right? Like, I don't see Pierre coming in and, destroying all the programs that have, been through the layers of bureaucracy and have been approved.
And so whenever I hear Conservative Party, I just think of, okay, no more policy changes with regards to climate change. And if there is a policy change, it is going to be backtracking to any progress that Canada has made.
A lot of conservation organizations I work with, when I was doing my field work, they're especially concerned, and they've kind of just been stockpiling their money over the last 4 years in fear that a potential Conservative government might take over. It's honestly going to be really bad news for a lot of my colleagues and a lot of the organizations that are in the climate nonprofit space.
I do think that a lot of the programs that, are there, that Trudeau's government, that the Liberals have put in, they are going to be in place for a while,
And then with the Conservative Party, I feel like it's going to be, they're going to tell you to their face what they're doing, which I guess is a good thing in the sense of honesty. But what they're doing will probably be everything against what we're trying to do to get to net zero or like net positive per se.
And, if the Conservatives were to come to power, if Pierre were to, make good on a lot of the promises that he's made, we might be taking steps backward. And for me personally, taking steps backward, especially on a national level, that would be quite concerning.
Have you noticed any changes in the climate where you live?
Yes, I have. I absolutely have.
We've been having snowstorms some days, and then the temperatures go to 10 degrees, 11 degrees, and then drops to -6, -10.
In October, it would be like hailing, and I'd be like, huh, what's going on here?
So it's really worrying because it's just showing the drastic change that has happened over the last 8 years.
There's been a lot more forest fires in British Columbia pretty much every year now.
It's not going to be like, the movies and the apocalypse. It's going to be gradual. And we're already feeling that gradual shift. It's tangible. It's there. It's in front of us. The time to do something is now.
Hasn't snowed for a while. It probably won't snow in Vancouver all year. Last year it only snowed once. So yeah, the changes are pretty obvious. Heat domes are happening all the time. Yeah, it's becoming a real issue in British Columbia.
How do you contribute to a cleaner world?
I think, like all things, it should start right at the personal level.
So one of the biggest changes I have made is going plant-based, becoming vegan. Because the animal agriculture industry is one of the highest carbon emissions that is impacting climate change.
Well, I grew up in British Columbia, so throughout a lot of my childhood, I've spent a lot of time in nature and have developed a pretty good connection to it.
Just those simple sustainable stops of like no more plastic toothbrushes because they end up in our landfill. So now I just use bamboo toothbrushes.
But the cool thing that I get to do is I get to talk to, 100, 150 Canadians every single day, and reach out to them and see if they're open to adopting cleaner energy for their homes.
The biggest thing I do is talk to as many people as I can, educating them on the knowledge that I have, because I do have a background in environmental justice. And so I focus on the intersectionality of humans, animals, and the environment.
On a larger scale, I now find myself in the renewable energy sector in terms of sustainable energy, solar, wind, and battery. My background is in integrated engineering, so I kind of found my platform now in this sector.
I had this unique experience where I was given an opportunity to start my own advocacy campaign, and me and my friend did something to promote urban tree equity in Vancouver. We collaborated with some organizations, with some community groups, and with a couple city councilors, and we ended up getting a motion passed at City Hall in Vancouver.
What would you do for the environment if you were Prime Minister?
The first action I would take was implement more sustainable food practices. You know, people really don't understand the animal agriculture industry in Canada. They think it doesn't have any intersection to climate change when it really does.
Maybe putting Indigenous people in power who kind of have this perspective already.
People think when they think climate change, they think pollution and they think plastic. But plastic isn't as big of a deal as, you know, the land degradation that happens in the animal agriculture industry.
What's necessary is more so a cultural shift than anything, like just kind of transitioning out of capitalism into a new kind of system where, you know, we're not spending all this money all the time, and there's different values that are in place.
Not only focusing on how it's negatively impacting the health of so many Canadians today, but also how it is literally one of the driving forces of climate change.
I do think that the government should spend a little bit more money on marketing. Fancy that, you know, like I think it's a little bit of that awareness, you know, because if they're doing the work behind the scenes, if they're having the hard discussions and debates and getting these policies approved, and, you know, they're hitting the market, but people aren't aware about them, that might be a little bit counterproductive.
So that's a taste of what the environmental debate in Canada is currently like. And there were lots of arguments in Parliament too before Justin Trudeau resigned as leader. Here are some of the fiery exchanges over the government's carbon tax.
The economic vandalism and carbon tax cover-up of this government has now been exposed.
For the Leader of the Opposition to consider that the forest fires that are taking people from their communities and destroying their homes are a mere distraction and not top of mind for people from coast to coast to coast is shameful. But the fact of the matter is he doesn't have anything to say about that because he refuses to put forward any real plan to fight against climate change, and he does nothing but fight against our plan to fight climate change. If he has a better plan, let him say it, because we've been waiting a long time for it. But he has no plan to fight climate change. He still questions whether it exists while Canada is burning.
How much will Eastern Canadian rural families be forced to pay in higher taxes on their home heating when this Prime Minister triples the carbon tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You know what Eastern Canadians are seeing right now, what they told me? They told me they're worried for the fact that there are going to be more intense storms in the coming years, that their kids and their grandkids are going to face a world in which extreme weather events are increasingly frequent, which will threaten not just their communities, not just their way of life, but their very future. The fact is, we need to continue to step up in the fight against climate change, something conservative politicians don't seem to understand, and the model that we have of putting a price on pollution returns more money every year to families who need it. That's the model we have. That's how we're helping Canadians as we fight climate.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It isn't working. He hasn't hit a single solitary climate target since he brought in this tax. According to the Liberal Premier of Newfoundland, rural families will have seen an 80% increase in their home heating costs when the carbon tax kicks in there. 40% of Atlantic Canadians live in energy poverty. The Prime Minister can insult these people and call them polluters while he jets around in his private jet. Or he can recognize that heating your home in January in rural Newfoundland is a basic necessity. How much will he impose in extra costs on those families when he trickles?
Right Honourable.
As you've just heard, the opposition had lots of issues with Trudeau's carbon tax. They argue that it drove up inflation and did little for the country's climate ambitions. The government thought its carbon tax was a great idea, of course they would, and as an incentive had designed it so that a percentage of the money that was raised ended back in Canadians' hands as a rebate. And funds raised from taxing local refineries and factories goes toward solar and wind technology. But if elected, opposition leader Pierre Poilievre says he'll axe the tax. His approach is also considered problematic. Although he does want to expand Canada's renewable capacity, he says more exports of natural gas will spur economic growth to address local issues regarding poverty and food availability.
Our secret sauce is our energy, our incredible supply of energy of all kinds, hydro, nuclear, natural gas, you name it. So let's unleash the production of these resources and bring all that money home.
We could try to organize things so that energy superpower wasn't an insulting phrase.
Well, National Bank did a study. If you want to talk to these environmental loons that hate our energy sector, they said, the great economist Stéphane Marion out of Calgary, National Bank, said if we displaced half of the electricity demand that India will have added to its grid over the next 20 years by supplying our natural gas instead of them using coal, it would reduce global emissions by 2.5 billion tons, which is 3 times the emissions of all of Canada. So in other words, by exporting our gas, which is half as emissions intensive as coal, we could do far more than we could even do if we shut our entire economy down and disappeared from the earth. So why don't we address the environment with energy abundance instead of energy poverty?
Well, that's obviously the moral thing to do with regards to the alleviation of absolute poverty as well.
Yeah.
Because there's an environmental case to be made for that too, which I learned about 15 years ago. If you alleviate absolute poverty, the people who are now comparatively wealthy, so say starting to move into the middle class, take a much longer term view of their lives and their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives, which are now relatively assured, and they're much more likely to take environmental action at the local level. So it looks like the fastest pathway to a genuinely green and sustainable future is through the eradication of absolute poverty.
Right.
And the most effective route to that is cheap energy.
Right.
So
absolutely.
So it looks like we could have a green future and eat our cake too, so to speak. And Canada could definitely be at the forefront of that.
Absolutely.
Here's a quick break to highlight what a few researchers in Canada are doing to prevent more insects from going extinct there.
L'effondrement de la biodiversité chez les insectes et de la biodiversité en général, elle est sans précédent. Dans toutes les extinctions massives qu'on a vécues par le passé, celle-ci se produit 1000 fois plus rapidement que celles qui se sont produites par le passé. Cette crise-là, elle évolue tellement rapidement qu'avec les méthodes conventionnelles de recherche, on n'est pas capable de la suivre adéquatement pour mettre en place les gestes nécessaires pour la ralentir, puis changer finalement, renverser la cadence pour restaurer la biodiversité. Des outils comme ça nous permettent de le faire à l'échelle et au rythme, même encore plus vite, pour qu'on puisse avoir des solutions disponibles pour les décideurs le plus rapidement possible.
The experts need help in gathering data not just on known species, but on the vast number of unknown species that are dying out, going extinct, before we've even recorded them.
Ici, on a la chose la plus importante, qui est la lumière UV, qui a été designée spécifiquement pour attirer des insectes nocturnes. Donc, elle couvre un spectre très, très large de longueur d'onde, de à peu près 100 de longueur d'onde jusqu'à plus de 400. Puis, ça permet d'attirer tous les insectes qui sont attirés par l'UV. Ils viennent se placer ici sur une plateforme qui est éclairée. Là, on a une caméra hermétisée, évidemment, tout ça, qui prend une photo à toutes les 10 secondes.
AI can label images of insects, provide species identifications, provide numbers, provide an analysis of how that biodiversity is now and how it's changing, and can do so for locations around the world and for many more locations than humans could possibly be out there looking at in the field.
Mais là, on trouve tout simplement des nouvelles espèces. Puis là, on travaille avec les experts en intelligence artificielle du MILA pour développer des algorithmes qui vont amorcer la description de la nouvelle espèce en identifiant les caractères qui sont nouveaux pour cette espèce-là, qui ne font pas partie du jeu d'entraînement.
Earlier, our guests discussed pipelines, and one notable project among the new fossil fuel initiatives launched under Trudeau's government is the Coastal GasLink pipeline in British Columbia. I won't go into specs here, but the whole thing was somewhat of a balancing act for Trudeau. On one hand, he had policies that were considered great steps for the environment, but people believe the government continued investment in the pipeline meant oil and gas wouldn't go away anytime soon, basically speaking. But the decision sparked nationwide protests from Indigenous groups and environmental activists who argue that the pipeline undermines Canada's treaty obligations with Indigenous people and contradicts the commitments made under the Paris Accord and locks the country into reliance on dirty energy for years and years to come.
For a leader who's managed to find the time to regularly march alongside his fellow Canadians at climate rallies, it was ironic that Justin Trudeau and his government were firm endorsers of new oil and gas pipelines, at least to environmentalists and Indigenous people.
Le gouvernement de Justin Trudeau, lors de son élection en 2015, a fait de la réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones un des principaux objectifs de son mandat, d'accord? Et donc, il a mis la barre très haute. Il a dit, nous, on va arriver à cette réconciliation-là. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, la réconciliation? Bien, ça veut dire un peu reconstruire la relation, hein? Reconstruire les ponts suite à un historique de politique coloniale qui visait à assimiler les individus, les nations autochtones, les faire disparaître.
Trudeau managed to convince most Indigenous communities that his pipeline vision was part of their future too. But not every one of them is on the same page. The Wet'suwet'en Nation believed their connection to the land far outweighs any profits promised by the government.
When they ignore us through their process at Royal Bank of Canada and say that they are doing for the betterment, they're only doing it for the betterment of their bottom line. Our bottom line is air, water, culture, survival for the future. When I go through the motions that they had there and they all got defeated, on behalf of the planet, they defeated all three that were there to protect the environment. They got defeated.
At the heart of the conflict is a $40 billion natural gas project, dubbed the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. It cuts through 22,000 square kilometers of the Wet'suwet'en Nation's unceded territory and brazenly runs through hundreds of ecologically sensitive waterways, including the habitat of the spawning sockeye salmon. The pipeline is meant to transport up to 5 billion cubic feet of LNG daily, but that would create around 265 million tons of CO2 a day, which is like burning over 136 million tons of coal. It's also the equivalent of the annual emissions of 59,000 cars. Wet'suwet'en chiefs opposed the pipeline from the start. Their leaders launched a nationwide movement, and the hashtag All Eyes on Wet'suwet'en went viral on social media.
Cette crise-là n'est pas nouvelle. Ce qui est nouveau, par contre, ce qui est intéressant, à mon avis, c'est que la mobilisation de la nation Wet'suwet'en, ou en tout cas des chefs traditionnels de la nation Wet'suwet'en et de leurs sympathisants, a créé un mouvement de solidarité à travers le Canada.
But the protest was not well received.
Reconciliation is a journey, and there are going to be difficult moments on that journey. But the fact remains, the barricades must come down.
When police turned up, it quickly turned into a standoff. And after the Royal Canadian Mounted Police violently cleared Indigenous encampments that blocked the worksite of the pipeline, things escalated.
Thousands of people who have been standing up across British Columbia saying, we'll do whatever it takes. And it's not just individual citizens. We're seeing this from municipalities, the city of Burnaby, the mayor of Vancouver, and also the British Columbia government has said, we'll do whatever it takes to stop this pipeline.
Amnesty International condemned the crackdown by Canadian authorities and pointed out that the pipeline was already causing environmental damage, disrupting access to ancestral lands and traditional activities like hunting and fishing.
Calling it Crown land, coming and terrorizing our people, criminalizing us, jailing us, and yet they have the nerve and the audacity to tell their shareholders and to lie to our hereditary chiefs' faces to say that they have consent and support of this project. And they are not taking into account the human rights violations that are happening on our territory.
Despite months of protests and heated confrontations,
As all of you well know, this is a situation that's very tense, very volatile.
No one backed down, including Coastal GasLink. Access to much of Wet'suwet'en land is now restricted to the pipeline company and Canadian police. Amnesty reports that whenever the Indigenous group try to return to their land, they're intimidated and harassed through police raids and the destruction of their property. Indigenous women have disappeared, and some have turned up dead. The pipeline is now complete, and gas set to be shipped worldwide in 2026.
And that's our show. Before I leave you, here's a look at Canada's wildlife. It's a country with a whole lot to lose if we do not get global temperatures under control.
Don't tell me that you're sorry, I'm bleeding on the floor. I thought that we were something, but you're closing all the doors. I'm running.